Hi everybody, and welcome to Club Entrepreneur Podcast, where we talk about entrepreneurship at our college campus and we interview experts in their field. My name is Will Duggan and I'm your co-host.
Hello everyone, I'm your second co-host Madhav, and I hope you all are as excited as we are to start off this podcast with a very special guest, Mr. Charlie Johnson. Although he has had a career as a business lawyer for over 30 years, he's known to most of us as professor who's teaching new venture financing in Isenberg right now. He's also Associate Director of Berthiaume Center of Entrepreneurship and is also working as a Managing Director of Maroon Ventures. He has represented over 200 startups and other emerging companies over his career. So let's hear from Mr. Johnson himself. Hello, it's a pleasure to have you on our podcast first episode. So just for our viewers, could you throw further light on your experiences, especially regarding entrepreneurship?
Right, well, I'm happy to be here, and you're right, I have been working with entrepreneurs for many years. As a business lawyer in Boston, I represented many entrepreneurs, many of them coming out of the universities in the Boston area. I also represented venture capital investors, so I've seen both sides of the table.
Yeah. So that's really exciting, and I guess just for us to get really into the weeds now, we just would like to start off by learning more about startup financing firstly. So we'd just like to start off with the general process of startup financing. Firstly, just for young entrepreneurs who are about to starting to build bootstrapping their startups. Let's start with the basics of what's the first difference in debt and equity financing for startup going.
Well, most startup companies aren't able to get debt financing, and the reason is because they don't have a track record, and they also don't have collateral. Banks look for collateral that they can lend against, or they look for a history of cash flow that they can lend against. And most startup companies don't have those attributes, and therefore they need to find financing. If they're going to get financing, they have to find equity financing from other sources. But even before you get to the financing, I think the entrepreneur has to consider whether their company is one that is going to attract financing. Maybe you can get financing from a close friend or a relative in relative modest amounts. But once you start getting into the world of angel investors, wealthy individuals investing in your company, or professional investors, venture capitalists, you really have to have a company that is going to be on a growth trajectory that isn't going to enable those investors to get a return on their investment. They're not usually interested in investing in a company that is not going to generate a significant return. So that's one of the early questions that an entrepreneur needs to really assess.
So before they get into a stage where they are able to generate cash flows for their business, at what stage do you think, like for example, in order to firstly start out by building the minimal viable product for their company, how do you think should they be able to find funding for that starting out? Should they just look for funding within their own the amount of capital that they can afford to build their MVP?
So first stop is usually a founder's own funds. And if they've accumulated some funds, then that's certainly a great place to start. For a young entrepreneur, oftentimes they haven't had the opportunity to accumulate funds. And so the most successes that I see are people that they either have a relationship with, it could be a friend or it could be a family, or it could be somebody who really understands their industry and is inclined to invest in their particular industry. Another thing that we're seeing is crowdfunding, and particularly with a product, something like Kickstarter can be a great way to raise funds for your company. What you're doing with a Kickstarter is that you are promising people who participate in your Kickstarter campaign that you will deliver to them a product, usually the product that you're building, or maybe it's an enhanced reward. So you get the product, and you also get a T-shirt and an opportunity to, tour the facility or whatever the additional benefit might be. You see bands that are raising funds for a new album. Sometimes if you give them enough money, they'll come and play your birthday party, for example. So crowdfunding is a great way to raise funds. You don't have to give up an equity ownership in the company, but it's also a great way to validate your product. You can see whether people really are interested in buying the product. So those are just some of the things that are at the disposal of early stage founders.
Now, I just want to clarify for a second there that you're talking about when you're in the MVP stage, it's great to go out there and start with Kickstarter and stuff like that, because you can verify you can validate your idea that there is value within your MVP before you actually build the product and get it out there to market, correct?
Yes. Well, for Kickstarter, you actually have to have an MVP product. I believe that Indiegogo, which is another one, doesn't require that you have the MVP built. But for Kickstarter, you don't have to have the full supply of products that you're going to provide. You just have to be able to demonstrate that you've built at least one that you can show them that this is for real. So you can't use Kickstarter if you only have an idea. You've actually got to build the MVP as you describe it.
Yeah, I think that the Kickstarter is an absolutely amazing way to be able to get funding right now. That's emerged over the last few years as a great way to make the lean startup even leaner, because you can avoid having to build the entire product in large batches and get it out there before you've even validated your idea at all. And so it allows you to be able to crowdsource that validation, which I think is really awesome. Besides for crowdsource funding, I want to talk a little bit about funding apart from equity and ask you, besides for debt and equity financing and crowdsourcing, are there any other avenues that people tend to go down to be able to fund their startups, or any new ways that people are coming out with right now?
Sure. Well, one of the things that we see on our campus is there are entrepreneurs who are able to obtain government grants. So the government is the Department of Defense, for instance, has the DARPA program, where they're looking for cutting-edge technologies and products that they can use in warfare. The National Institute of Health is another government program that funds research projects that hopefully will become translational research and turn into products. So if you can get a government grant and not have to give up equity, it's called non-dilutive funding. If you can do that for your company, that's great, because the founders will continue to own 100% of the company. They can get some funding, and they don't have to give up any ownership interest. So certainly that's something that you should pursue if it's available.
Now, we have something similar to that on our campus, correct? I think it's through the I-Corps program?
Yeah, the I-Corps program gets entrepreneurs ready to obtain government grants. I think a little bit of money does come with the I-Corps program as well, but most of the work in the I-Corps program is to get companies ready to get larger government grants.
So let's so if we go ahead in the step of funding after we further stages of funding in the startup, there's angel investing, and then there is other venture capitalists, and so just in the recent years people are getting more and more aware of how so many startup unicorns are coming out with their Series A funding, seed funding, and all these different rounds of fundings that they're going through. But you have had experiences where ventures and all, you have said, with private equity funds and venture capitalist funds. So just to give a basic framework or structure for our viewers to understand how the funding process goes, just a brief steps of funding for startups.
So you're right that there are stages of investment, and so you mentioned angel investors. So what's that world look like, and how does that operate? Angels are not people with wings and halos. At least in the world of investing. Angel investors are typically wealthy individuals, and oftentimes they will gather in angel groups. So there's one called River Valley Investors that's based in Springfield. Common Angels is one that actually used to operate in Boston but is no longer, but Launchpad and Hub Angels are a couple of others that come to mind. So how do these groups work? Typically, they will meet on a monthly basis. Typically, they will invite 3 different entrepreneurs to come in and pitch their business. They'll give them 10, 15 minutes to pitch the business. Then they will answer questions from the angels in the audience, and usually you'll have 20 or 30 people in that room listening to the pitch. Then they'll ask the entrepreneurs to leave, and the moderator of the angel group will then ask people what they think, and ultimately, if there are people that are interested in further considering the investment, then they will form a due diligence team where they will follow up and work with the entrepreneurs to learn more about the markets and their plan to bring the product to market or whatever it might be. They'll go through what's called a due diligence process. They will then invest. And angels, if a bunch of them are interested in investing, maybe the entrepreneurs can raise a few $100,000. The checks that angels write typically are in the $10,000 to $25,000 range individually. And so if you get obviously 8 $25,000 investments, you've now got $200,000. So that's for relatively early stage companies. Then as companies grow and they begin to penetrate their market, they begin to generate some revenues. Now you're starting to get into the world of venture capital investors where the checks are larger. Maybe the company is seeking to raise a couple of $1 million. Oftentimes, venture capital investors will invest as part of syndicates. So if a firm is looking to raise several million dollars, they may not get just one check from one investor, but you might have 2 or 3 investors that are going to participate in that round so that they can spread the risk a little bit. And also, the hope is that investors will bring more than just money to the table. They'll bring contacts, they'll bring potential customers, they'll bring potential board members, they'll maybe be able to introduce you to some key employees that you need to be able to hire. And so there is a benefit of having multiple venture firms invest in your company so that more of those resources can be brought to the table. Over the last number of years, venture capital firms have grown in size. And so where you might have a venture capital firm that at one point in time raised a $50 million fund, as they raise subsequent funds, the size of the funds tend to get larger and larger. So if I have a successful $50 million fund, I might try to raise $100 million the next time. And then as I have even more successful funds, then I'll try to have larger and larger funds. And what that has caused is that the venture capitalists tend to also have to write larger checks. Because if you think about it, unless you're really going to grow the number of people working in the venture capital firm, they've only got so much bandwidth. And so if I've got a $100 million fund, I'd rather make $25 million investments than $101 million investments, because it just means that I'd have to follow 5 times more companies. And so that means that what you're seeing is that venture capital funds have to write larger and larger checks, and there is a gap for companies that don't need those large checks. Maybe they only want to raise a small amount of capital at the outset to reach certain milestones and increase their valuation. And if they have to write too large a check or accept too large a check at the outset, they'll have to be giving up a considerable amount of their equity. So one of the challenges for early stage entrepreneurs is to find the right fit between the size of the check that they need and the investor who is in a position to write the size check that they're looking for.
Just to follow up on that, like not only in terms of check, but I also assume that in terms of the strategic aligning those strategic visions of both like the startup founder as well as the investor, like is there also this risk or the downside, like how important it is for you to find some fit investor through whom you can find those strategic partnerships, or also at least there's no conflict between both the startup founder and the investor. Like you also see cases where the startup founders have like this suddenly there's this lack of freedom once they get funding, and like they have to like more of this due diligence goes into following up with them instead of focusing on the startup.
Well, you've given me a lot in that question.
Yeah.
But I think your point is a really good one. There needs to be an alignment between the vision of the founder and the investor. So I think that and I think that's pretty clear at the outset, because the investor probably wouldn't be writing a check if they didn't believe in the plan for the enterprise. But over time, the business may not evolve as everybody hopes, and so there needs to be some changes, and sometimes it's determined that the founder CEO is not the right person to be leading the company through growth. Sometimes the company finds that just the market is not there for their product. There's not a product market fit, and so there needs to be a change in the business. There needs to be what we call a pivot. Mm-hmm. And so that's when the founder and the venture capitalist really have to put their heads together and work together to figure out what the right direction of the path is. I think there's a bit of a misconception on the part of some founders that venture capitalists are going to, come in and take over control of their business and run their lives. And for the reason I just said, venture capitalists are busy. Many of them are tracking a dozen or so companies, which means that there's a dozen or so companies where they've got to go to at least quarterly board meetings and then be involved with the company a lot between board meetings. That's a handful. And so the venture capitalists are really not interested in coming in and taking over the business. They don't have the bandwidth. And so, do changes have to be made sometimes? Yes. And oftentimes a smart entrepreneur will be the first one to recognize that they may not necessarily be the right person to be scaling the company. So there's a lot involved in the relationship, but hopefully it's a positive one.
Now, I just want to ask you a bit about, you talked a lot about venture capitalists and angel investing. Angel investing, if I'm correct, is also an equity form of capital. And I was just kind of wondering, since the startups are much earlier in their life when they go to get angel investing, are they generally giving up more equity for the money that they're getting? Is it more of a predatory lending practice?
Well, the earlier you invest in a company, the riskier the investment is. And so to compensate for that risk, a very early stage investor should get a larger equity piece in the company because there's so much more risk involved. Later on, when there's a customer base, when there's a clear revenue stream, that same dollar amount of investment should not command as large a slice of the equity pie because there's less risk involved. So there's definitely the level of risk certainly should coincide with the amount of the equity that the investor obtains. And there's some investors who really like to invest very, very early because they will get a larger slice of the pie. There are others who like to invest in later stage companies. And I think one of the things that an entrepreneur should do is when they're looking for investors, they should not only consider the industry. So investors, particularly the venture capital firms, are increasingly focusing on particular industries. So somebody who invests in drugs and life sciences is not going to be the same venture capital firm that invests in software or cybersecurity and so forth. But you not only should look at industry, but you should also come to learn at what stage does the investor invest in. And that's certainly another area that entrepreneurs should make sure that they're understanding when they reach out to investors, at what stage do they invest.
So, in your experience, were there more often, have you seen startup founders who were in the need of funding, but weren't clear on the amount of funding they needed for the startup?
Well, one of the questions is, how much money should I take? And should I just take enough capital to reach whatever the milestone is that I'm trying to achieve, like to build my prototype? Or should I take a little bit more? And I think that I've seen many entrepreneurs wish in retrospect that they'd taken a little bit more, because it often takes a little bit longer than we hope and expect to build that prototype. So, and yet they, particularly early on, for the reasons I just expressed, that early money can command a significant amount of the equity capital of the company. They don't want to take on too much money because they're giving up too large a slice of the pie. So usually what a smart entrepreneur will do is they'll think about, how much money do I need to take in order to accomplish something that reaches a milestone that is going to increase the value of my company. And if I increase the value of the company, then when I go back to get that next stage of financing, the company is now more valuable, and so that next tranche of funding is not going to command as large a slice of the pie. So being able to anticipate that and think that through is certainly part of the equation.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask before we move on from funding, but just quickly about private equity. I know that there's a lot, that term gets thrown around a lot, and I know a lot of college students who don't fully understand what private equity is. So I wondered if you could just talk for a minute about what private equity is and how it relates to later stage startups being acquired.
Sure. So if you think about the stages and the process of raising capital for a company, the first thing you want to think about is, and we've talked about this, is, do I have my own funds available? And so that, and when I'm using my own funds and my own resources, that's what we call bootstrapping. And then the next progression is to go to angels and to go to wealthy individuals, and we've talked about that. And then the next stage is venture capital. So the venture capitalists are still investing at a relatively early stage of the company, and then as the company matures and they've really developed a revenue stream, they've really locked down their technology, they've locked down their business processes, they've locked down their execution plan, they may be positioning themselves to either sell the company to a Google or Medtronic or Boston Scientific or Johnson & Johnson, some large company, or they may be looking to position themselves to go public and to provide liquidity for their investors through those vehicles. And oftentimes there's some work to be done in order to get you there. You may need to invest a significant amount of money in marketing, for instance, or advertising. You may need to do an acquisition of a company to complement whatever it is that you've developed. And so that later stage financing where the company has really taken shape, but we need to just more gasoline to put on the fire, is when the private equity investor will come in to help provide funding in order to get you to that ultimate exit. Now, because they're coming in later, they're not going to be commanding as the same price per share that the early investors get, but oftentimes they're investing pretty significant sums, so they will be taking a significant part of the company. You also see private equity investors come in and buy out the earlier investors. So that's another thing that they might do. And you might have a situation, say, where management wants to continue with the business, but you may have some earlier investors who want some liquidity because they're venture capitalists who need to return funds to their own investors, or some folks want to cash out for whatever reason. So you might have a management team go out to private equity investors who have significant amounts of sums available for investment, and they might take out all the old investors, and management will continue with a whole new set of investors. So that's yet another way in which private equity investors might enter the picture.
Okay, and just to clarify, private equity firms are generally like large funds with a bunch of with many investors going into the funds, like through retirement packages and stuff. Is that correct?
Well, there's a lot of similarity between venture funds and private equity funds. The difference is the number of zeros.
Okay.
So both venture funds and private equity funds look to raise capital from endowments or pension funds or large pools of capital. It's just that the private equity funds some of them have well over $1 billion at their disposal. And so they've gotten large amounts from even more endowments and even more pension funds in order to raise capital for their funds. But there's a lot of similarity in terms of the structure of the investment. Whether you're a private equity investor or you are a venture capital investor, you're going to be buying preferred stock, which means that when the company is liquidated, that money the investment can come off the top back to the investors before the founders and management employees start to participate in the proceeds. And so there are similarities, and really the big difference is the number of zeros involved.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that explanation there.
Yeah, so now moving on from the process of funding, we wanted to hit upon your get some your views from your background as a lawyer, business lawyer. So, firstly, how did that help you in assessing startups going forward in terms of understanding their product feasibility?
Sure. So I was a business lawyer at a large firm in Boston, and one of the things that I did regularly is I went to meetings of boards of directors of companies. And what I found that I got a tremendous education from going to board meetings where the company strategy was discussed. How are we going to grow the business? Should we invest in more technology? Should we invest more in our employees? How should we compensate employees? I could go on with all of the kinds of many issues that are addressed at board meetings. And I found that it was a real cumulative process. And so even across many different industries, a lot of the same kinds of issues would arise. What kind of company culture do we want to create, and so forth. Every time I worked with a different company, I'd learn a lot about their industry. I'd learn a lot about how they operated their businesses. I had the good fortune to be working working with management teams that were at the top of their industry, and so I was able to learn so much from them that I could then bring to other companies that I was working with and bring that experience to bear. So that really was where my education came from.
Yeah. So that's great. I guess that would that must have helped you in if you go on the product side of a startup, if someone's building a startup, and what kind of problems do you think will they encounter going forward in the process of funding when things like patents or those issues come up? But there are also other side of the issues where there are other regulatory issues. Did you see any startups that went far ahead in their funding or started scaling, but then there was a very prominent legal barrier that stopped them from going?
Well, so you mentioned patents,
yeah.
And one of the challenges with patents is that patents are expensive to obtain. There's a lot of legal work involved. When you file with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office for a patent, it's just it's not simply a filing that you send in and it comes back with a rubber stamp. There's comments that come back from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and usually there's a back and forth that can take a number of years. And there's a lot of legal work, and there's also a lot of management time involved in something like that. And so you need to be, when you're looking for patents, you need to be very strategic in terms of, I'm probably not going to be able to patent every little nook and cranny of my product. Mm-hmm. So I need to be very strategic in terms of thinking about what do I want to patent. One way to perhaps visualize it is like a picket fence. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a fence around my product to keep others from misappropriating it. And it's not going to be a solid fence. It's not going to be a fence that you can't see through. But I'm going to be very strategic in terms of where am I going to place those vertical boards or patents to be able to keep intruders out. So certainly, that's something. And the other thing is that if you get a patent and somebody infringes on you, it takes a lot of legal time and expense to go pursue somebody. So you got to decide, do I want to invest in pursuing somebody who might be infringing on me? So that's just one of many areas. Another one you mentioned, regulatory.
Right.
So I think one of the things that is really important for an entrepreneur is to really understand the regulatory framework of whatever the industry is that they're working in. So, for instance, I did a lot of work with medical device companies and healthcare companies. And so if I've got a medical device, I've got to have a very solid understanding of what my strategy is for getting FDA approval for my medical device. Because before I can use a medical device in humans, I've got to make sure that I've got the regulatory approval from the FDA to be able to do that. And there are a number of different pathways. And one of the things that I sometimes see with entrepreneurs is that they really haven't thought through what the regulatory pathway is. There are some very good consultants out there that you have to make use of. Most entrepreneurs who are developing a medical device may be very proficient at building that device and know what the need is for that device, but they may not have the experience to really know what the best strategy is for working with the FDA, and that's where getting a good consultant, just like getting a good patent lawyer, is critical, for your path forward.
Yeah, thank you for the explanation. Do you have any questions for you?
So my question relates to, there's the basic law required to building a startup. Like, beyond just patents and stuff like that, is there anything else that startups should be looking at when they're building themselves out that'll put them ahead of the curve by knowing this little piece of information here and there?
Well, there are a number of what I would call traps for the unwary that maybe venture into the world of legal issues. So I did a bunch of work with businesses coming out of the universities. A lot of them, most of them were ventures that came out of MIT. My firm had a close relationship with MIT. And you would see students working together on a project, and then somebody would graduate. And you might have a team of 4, and then one person goes off and they get a job somewhere and they leave the venture. And then if the venture becomes successful, that person then comes back knocking on the door saying, well, I was there at the outset and I was there helping to get this company launched. And remember that I think there was a story like that at the outset of Facebook, where with the Winklevoss brothers came back and they said, well, we were involved in that. So thinking about who owns what and have real clarity in terms of who's entitled to equity in the company is something that is critical. It's also important that the company own the inventions, own the intellectual property of the company. So if you or I were to invent something, as the inventor, we could file a patent and own the intellectual property ourselves. And so when we're starting a company, it's important that we make sure that the intellectual property has been assigned over to the company. So those are just a couple of examples of the kinds of things that you really need to be thinking about at the outset. And you might say to yourself, well, we'll get to that later, we'll get to that in due course. And the challenge is that if somebody departs, now they're across the country or they're working somewhere else and maybe you're not on the best terms with them. And so it's best to get these things addressed at the outset when everybody's working together on, in sync and on good terms.
So just to follow up on if someone's going out of the country, did you make any investments outside of the U.S. Were there any challenges related to that? Well,
yes. I mean, I worked on a number of companies that that were based outside the country or had investors outside of the country. The laws are different in different parts of the country. So we just talked a moment ago about getting approval from the FDA. So in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration looks at both the safety of a device or a drug. They also look at its efficacy. Does it work? And whereas the regulatory scheme in Europe is more safety-based, and so there are differences between the regulatory schemes in the United States and abroad. The labor laws are different. The labor laws are much more employee favorable in Europe than they are in the United States. It's much more difficult to terminate people. It's much more difficult to close a plant in Europe than it is in the United States. And I could go on. There's a number of differences. So, and I certainly didn't hold myself out or could purport to be an expert on the laws in the Netherlands or Germany or Brazil. And so part of the process is to find experts, counterparts overseas who could serve as local counsel and advise our U.S.-based company on the laws in whatever jurisdiction they might be working in. By the same token, I would provide advice on U.S. laws to companies based overseas. So it goes both ways.
So you advise companies from the outside of the U.S. And so did you see any difference between startups that were from the U.S. and startups that were coming from outside of the U.S. in terms of their understanding of the customer?
Not really. I mean, I think that in terms of customer understandings, I mean, I think it's important for you to focus on, our customer is going to buy this. Now, maybe buying preferences might be different in different cultures, and I mean, we can't overlook that. But I think at the end of the day, in the global world that we're living in, where things can be purchased on the internet from different parts of the country or the world, I think that the similarities are greater than the differences.
So do you think like it would be easier for startups to become like an outsourcing company who's like providing services to people in the other parts of the country, in other parts of the world outside of the country? Like, do you think that practice is going to get more and more evolved?
I don't know. I think it's going to depend on what the product is. Mm-hmm. And I think that if I were talking to an entrepreneur from our campus, for instance, I think I to the extent that they're going to do some customer discovery and find out whether customers are really interested, I think I'd start closer to home so that I can actually sit down with the customers face to face and get direct feedback. But it's going to vary depending upon if I'm creating a product that is, targeted for a particular somebody with a particular cultural background or ethnic background. Certainly that's where I'm going to want to focus.
All right, and I just wanted to ask if, when you're looking at businesses from different cultures and different countries, if there's a difference in approach, how they take to building their business and different strategies that they use that are successful in other areas of the world.
Not that I've really seen. I mean, not that comes to mind.
Yeah, I feel like from what I've learned, it's primarily just a set of strategies that you kind of just have to work through no matter where you are. But I was wondering if there was like other cultural barriers in other countries that might be like changing the way that they approach things. I'm just not too familiar with that. Yeah,
well, I would say that, I certainly did see some differences in negotiating style when I was dealing with folks from different parts of the world. And, maybe there's some differences there, but I think that, I've worked with, I've seen technologies coming from all over the world, and again, I've seen more similarities in terms of how to go about growing the business than differences.
Absolutely. And I wanted to touch on how you've been part of Maroon Ventures, and I wanted to ask if there are any common traits you found in successful businesses that you've funded, like traits that these businesses have had early on and they maybe continue to have to this day that have you believe have helped make them the success that they are now.
Right. Well, so one of the things that we found was that there were companies that were had maybe received some government grants, but they weren't really quite in a position to be able to go out and get venture capital financing because they just hadn't really reached certain milestones yet. The kind of milestones like some proof of revenues, or maybe the prototype has been completed, or maybe there's more testing that needs to be done in order to attract venture capital financing. And so we created the Maroon Venture Fund to try to fill that gap. And we raised $5.9 million, and we have invested in about a dozen companies. Two of them to date have not survived. Two of them had to close up, which is not necessarily surprising when you're making these very, very early stage investments. But of the 10 remaining companies, none of them have exited yet. They're all growing nicely. They, after receiving funds from us, from the Maroon Fund, they've gone on to raise additional financing. So in part, that mission has been accomplished. They're in various industries. We've got a food product, seed-based bars. We've got online yoga. We've got various devices that are used for measuring diagnostic devices and so forth, and each of them are progressing nicely, and the founders of the companies remain running the businesses and are growing in their roles, and I think learning a lot. I might mention the yoga business started as a B2C, a business to consumer, and what they evolved and found that by providing yoga classes to companies, the companies could provide as an employee benefit was really the best way for them to scale, and they've gone on to raise additional funding. And I won't take you through the story of each, but each in their own way, I think, are growing nicely, which is what warms our hearts as supporters of the UMass entrepreneurial ecosystem.
That I guess also goes on to show how important it is for the startups to be flexible, even if they are while growing, finding more profitable opportunities for them to grow. So one last question, what are your views on the instant startup valuations that's going on since the past few years? I take special interest in fintech industry especially, but then I recently read an article where there's the pre-seed valuation of average startup is around $30 million. Do you think this is going to continue, or this is even sustainable?
Well, we haven't seen that. Yeah. I mean, the companies that we've invested in are very, very early stage. We have not invested in the fintech sector. Mm-hmm. None of us, there are 5 of us on the investment committee, and I don't think any of us really know enough about fintech really to be able to make thoughtful investments, and so maybe those valuations are very, very high. The valuations of the early stage product companies tend to be at the very early stages less than $5 million. And so we're not seeing startup companies where they really haven't gotten any traction with valuations anywhere close to $30 million. And and if we were investing, our typical investments are about $250,000, we wouldn't be having much impact if we're investing $250,000 on a $30 million pre-money valuation. So we wouldn't be a good fit for that anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And before we end our last closing question, we just want to close out with what is your advice for our ambitious and budding entrepreneurs on UMass campus?
Well, so I'm excited about the entrepreneurial activity on campus. I teach a class on new venture finance. I teach a class on launching and growing the entrepreneurial venture. I do a lot of speaking to groups around campus. I regularly speak over at our Life Sciences Center, ISLES, on entrepreneurial issues. And then, of course, companies that are coming to the Maroon Fund for funding, I have visibility into. So, I mean, I think that there is I'm now in my 7th year at UMass Amherst, and I look back at the difference, where the entrepreneurial community was when I first came to campus and where it is today, and I think that it's groups like your entrepreneurship club that have been a tremendous catalyst in terms of encouraging entrepreneurial activity. And I'm really encouraged by the students that I have in my classes and the good questions that they're asking, and how quickly they learn this, some of the fundamentals of entrepreneurship. And then I guess the last thing I would say is that I'm now have been teaching long enough so that I hear regularly from former students. And I love getting the excited phone calls from a former student saying, gee, I want to tell you about what I've just done. And I get a lot of those phone calls. And so I think we're doing great.
All right, awesome. That's all the time we have for today. We appreciate you for your time, and we appreciate our viewers. Thank you, everybody.
Good.
Have a nice day.
Good to be with you guys. Thank you.
Bye.